Welcome to Week 5, Lecture 2 of HIH227, HIL227 Medieval Britain. And today we're going to talk about the broad sweep of economic and demographic change that occurs up to round about 1348-49 when the plague strikes. But there are other factors we'll discuss too, the so-called Great Famine, and some issues concerning the long-term demographic trajectory after the plague. This lecture is really meant to equip you with the basic knowledge necessary in order to be able to think constructively about various theoretical interpretations of this pattern of demographic and economic change as set out in next week's two lectures. So this is really just laying the groundwork here with a lot of nuts and bolts. But do try and pay attention and take it in, because it is important to understanding much of the rest of the course. So here's a good place to start. This is a rough overview of population change in England, for which we have much more direct surviving evidence of population change than we do for Scotland, Wales, or Ireland. This is taken from John Russell's study of medieval English population, but also supplemented by a whole series of other texts. The key book that you'll want to seek from the library, or indeed view as an e-book via the iFind catalogue, is Mark Hatcher and John Bailey's Modelling the Middle Ages. Again, that's Hatcher and Bailey Modelling the Middle Ages. Now, what you'll see here is that between roughly 1050 and 1300, the population of England trebles from around 2 million persons to up to around 6 million persons. What you'll see at the very peak here is a short decline from 1315 to 22, represented, let me get my pointer up here. Let's see here. Here we are, represented by this decline in the graph here. This is a so-called Great Famine, which is a subsistence crisis caused in part, or at least exacerbated, by very bad weather, particularly in 1315 to 1318, and then cattle-destroying plague, cattle murrain, in 1321 to 22. This long decline here represents the fall caused by the Black Death, in which we see roughly 30 to 50% mortality, both in an initial outbreak, but in a whole series of subsequent lesser outbreaks, right up to 1361, which is the so-called Children's Plague, the last major plague event before plague settles in and just becomes an endemic part of life, burbling away with occasional outbreaks for the rest of the Middle Ages. Okay, so why does population grow? Now, it might not seem strange to us from a modern perspective that population should treble between 1066 and 1300. After all, we've seen something like a trebling of world population in the course of last century. But if we look at the very long term of human history, in fact, population growth tends to be very, very low. Historically, if we look back over the last, 5,000 or 6,000 years, the very long-term typical population growth rate was something like a compound growth rate of about 0.05% per annum. The population growth rate in this period between 1066 and 1300 was somewhere between 0.3 and 0.5% per annum as a compound growth rate. That's to say, between the year 1066 and 1300, population in Western Europe was growing at about 10 times the typical rate seen over the course of the previous 1,000 years. It might shock you to know that the population growth rate for the last 50 years has been a remarkable 1.5 to 2%. So amazingly, that's 4 times the population growth rate of this demographically significant period between 1066 and 1300. I'll try and avoid long digression here, but let's put it this way. If it's worthy of academic study to try and... so here we have a depiction on the left of the scratch plough. Now, this is a depiction taken from ancient Egypt. The scratch plough has been around as long as people have been farming. What you have here effectively is a sharp stick pulled by an oxen, and it moves along and breaks up the top couple of inches of soil. Scratch plough works just fine in places where you have shallow, sandy soils. And the Nile River Valley in ancient Egypt is really a kind of poster child for this. What you have is thin, sandy soils on either side of the River Nile. Once a year, the Nile floods. The floodwaters deposit a thin layer of nutrient-rich sediment on the surface, right on top of the ground, and the farmers come by with a scratch plough, and they break up the surface. The scratch plough is still around today. Not terribly long ago, I saw a BBC documentary on South Sudan, and there in the background was a chap using a scratch plough. Again, they have thin, sandy soils in that particular location. The problem with the scratch plough is twofold. Number one, it only ever disturbs the top couple of inches of soil, and if you're not constantly replenishing the nutrients in the top couple of inches, then you quickly exhaust the soil. Number two, because you're only disturbing the top little bit of earth, there's not very much spongy, water-absorbent soil to surround your seeds. And so if you get heavy rain, you'll find that the water will pool or perhaps run off the surface, taking the seed with it and so forth. Now, in Northern Europe, where we aren't farming always in river basins, though in this depiction, oh no, I think that's a road in the background there. Right, but in Northern Europe, where we're not always farming in river basins, where there's the broad European plain, or even in England, for example, so-called champion England of mostly lowland farming country from Devon diagonally up to the north of Lincolnshire. There we find that we have a lot of rain and not much regular natural fertilization. And so the solution is to use a so-called heavy plough. You see it depicted here with a wheel, a long plowshare in the back. It digs very deeply into the soil. It could be weighted on the back to make it even heavier, to make it dig deeper. And because rather than working in the top 2 inches, it's working in maybe a foot of soil, you're constantly bringing up more nutrients from deeper in the earth that haven't yet had the goodness sapped out of them by growing grain. Now, that doesn't last forever. Even if you're digging 18 inches deep in the soil and turning it over from year to year, eventually all of that soil will have been exposed to the roots of grass crops like wheat and oats, and it will all eventually become exhausted, as we say, of depleted soils. But that will take much longer. Number two, we have a lot of rain in Northern Europe. Digging the soil up very deeply, sort of fluffing it up as you would a foot deep, means that you have a lot more soil there which is prepared to sponge up the rainwater and allow that water to go deeper into the soil and prevent it from rotting your grain seeds which are up on the surface. Now, the other thing I want to say a word about here is this idea of the 2-field system versus the 3-field system and crop rotation. If we were back in the year 1000, the normal way of farming your land was to divide it into 2, plant crops on half of it, pasture your animals on the other half. They will, do some manuring on their own and restore the soil a little. It means that you're farming 50% of your fields at any given time. Now that works when you have a relatively low population density. When you have a lot more people and you're desperate to produce more food, you can't afford to leave half your fields fallow all the time. So instead what they do is they divide the land into three. In one part you grow grain, such as wheat. In a second part you grow something that restores nitrogen to the soil, such as beans, a so-called legume crop or nitrogen-fixing crop. And then one-third you leave fallow to put your animals on. Now, there's a long-term trajectory here where the temptation is always to try and pasture your animals on just a little bit less land, to try and grow grain on just grain or beans on just a little bit more land, because that's, produces more food per acre than pasture land. The difficulty is eventually you reach a point where you don't have enough fallow land to support your animals, but the animals are the ones who pull the ploughs to make farming possible in the first place. And so you end up with what in some instances has been termed by Professor Rodney Hilton, among others, a functional insufficiency of livestock. In the short term, moving to the three-field system increases output because you're farming 2/3 of your land instead of half, but it speeds up the rate at which you deplete the soil. It exposes more soil to erosion every year because it's plowed up and rain can wash it away. And eventually, if you dedicate too much land to arable agriculture, you don't have enough room to support the animals that pull the plows, and so you end up in a sort of zero-sum game. Some relative numbers here. In England, population in 1300 is about 6 million. This is about 79 persons per square mile, but the more important number, far and away, is this figure in red at the right here, regarding lowland population density. So these are the grain growing areas that produce most of the food. It's between 5 and 10 times more efficient in terms of calorie production to grow grain compared to rearing cattle. And so it's the intensive farming of lowland agricultural zones that's able to support the increasing population, and it's there where you see the highest population density. People tend to live where the food is. That's a maximum that will help you understand national histories throughout the ages. Now, by comparison, Ireland here, with a lowland population density of around 51, is only half as densely populated as England. Scotland, 67, is less densely populated than England, although some lowland areas of Scotland are so far north that they too aren't much good for farming grain. Wales is a little bit anomalous in a variety of ways. Notice here that we're talking about circa 1300. So Wales, at the end of nearly 2 centuries of English colonization, has a lowland population density of 92 persons per square mile. That's to say about 10% less than England. So it still is less densely populated than England, but if one were to look back, say to the year 1100, prior to the arrival of English colonists, it's quite possible that the population density of Wales would look more like that of Scotland. And really, when we talk about why do people from England engage in colonization of Ireland and Wales, it's largely to do with a flow of persons from an area of high population density to an area of low population density, or lower, shall I say. Is this a Malthusian crisis? Now, I'll come back to various models used to interpret economic change in the Middle Ages in next week's 2 lectures, and I'll talk there about them in some depth. But I would wager that some, if not all of you, have already heard of this chap, Thomas Malthus, at A level or perhaps earlier in your education. Of course, he's responsible for this very basic theory from the really the roots of it probably go back in his mind to the 18th century. So it's a very old concept here, but it's beautiful in its simplicity, and it says population naturally increases until it outstrips food resources, at which point famine is a natural check on population growth. But after famine frees up resources, the population begins to increase again until famine checks population again, and that this is cyclical. You'll sometimes hear these checks on population referred to as a positive check, not positive in a emotional sense, but rather positive in the sense that it directly drives down population density. It's true, there are famines cyclically in the 1280s, 1290s, in the early 14th century, where grain shortage is chronic. In England, we have famine in the 1290s, particularly in 94, 95. But again, in 1315 to 17, the so-called Great Famine, which, depending on how you reckon the end of it, is either followed or runs through the 1321 to 22 period, when we see cattle murrain, which destroys herds of cattle, and also more crop failure. Did people lack the capacity to adapt? This is a basic question. One we might ask now. Keep in mind that if this period is exceptional because population growth was 10 times the previous 2 millennia, then surely we have to ask the same question of ourselves now, when population growth is 10 times what it was even at this medieval anomalous period of growth. How do people adapt? Well, they simply have less children, or that's the obvious way people could adapt. But there's not a whole lot of evidence of it. We'll come back to this again next week from a more theoretical point of view, but generally speaking, there's a little evidence of self-correction. We see some, for example, manors, for which we have a lot of local records, indicating a slight decline in population between 1322 and 48, perhaps suggesting that people are having less kids, but then again it might also be that people are so damaged as a result of malnutrition from the Great Famine that there's a generation of people in the 1320s and 30s who would otherwise be famine and have, otherwise be healthy and have a lot of children, who in fact are having less children that survive. We don't really know. There are two great disasters in the 14th century. The first disaster is the so-called Great Famine. The second disaster is plague, and we'll come back to that in due course. Historians have asked, to what extent is the Great Famine, so-called, about the weather, and to what extent is it about overpopulation, or alternatively, to what extent is it about social organization? I'll try and unpack these each. If we start with the weather, a cold, wet spring happened at 1315. Seeds rot in the fields. The harvest is poor at the end of the year, and by early 1316, grain prices soar, someplace incredibly to 10 or more times their usual price. For example, grain prices in Ruthin, Dyffryn Clwyd in North Wales, increased from about 3.5 shillings per quarter of wheat to about 7 shillings per quarter of wheat. Now, this is the price horizon above which we begin to see increased mortality associated with grain prices. So we know statistically that if grain increases to more than 7 shillings per quarter, that we begin to see more people paying inheritance tax, for example. And this allows us to, as a proxy measure, to see increased mortality. Western Europe in this period enters what's been called the so-called Little Ice Age, when for 2 to 3 decades following 1315, we have typically cooler summers and wetter winters. During this period, the River Thames in London used to freeze, and they held a special ice market out on the river. It's hard to imagine that happening now because the Thames hasn't froze for decades, due to the fact that we're in a warm phase just now, for whatever reason. Now, in about 1300, wheat was grown in Scotland further north than farmers would be able to grow it until the early modern period, until well into the 1500s. We know this from estate records, for example. This cattle murrain, which strikes, around 1321, comes just at a time when people are recovering from the cyclical failure of their crops. And when this cattle murrain arrives, it kills at least half of livestock. It's hard to gauge just how much, but 50% is a good estimate. People have speculated what it was. It might have been rinderpest, for example, might have been anthrax. A variety of possibilities have been suggested. Some of you might remember images on television from the foot and mouth crisis some years ago now, where so many diseased cattle died that the government was making huge piles of them and burning them just to get rid of the infected remains. That's pretty much what we're looking at here in the Middle Ages, but nowhere near 50% of all cattle died in that murrain. And so you have to imagine something of greater magnitude, but without people's modern ability to efficiently dispose of the dead animals. Here's a bit of a primary source for you. This is a so-called poem on the evil times of Edward II. It has another name as well. It's also called the simile. The simile is the practice of a priest illegally being parish priest more than one parish at the same time, therefore getting a double income. That was one of many things complained about in this poem. But incidentally, it happens to include an interesting bit here about the famine. So it's written around about 1321, so just about the time that the second wave of famine is happening in conjunction with cattle murrain. Quote, "When God saw that the world was so overcrowded, he sent a dearth on earth and made it full hard. A bushel of wheat was at 4 shillings or more, of which men might have had a quarter before. And then they turned pale, who had laughed so loud, they became all docile, who before were so proud. A man's heart might bleed for to hear the cry, O poor men who call out, alas, for hunger, I die." Now, there's all kinds of interesting stuff here and in the poem at large, but I want to point out a couple of things for you here. I've already mentioned the price of a quarter of wheat. Now, a quarter is a term for 8 bushels of wheat. Now, a bushel of wheat, if you extend your arms in front of you and put your hands together to form a circle, a basket about that big around at about 20 centimeters deep is a bushel. 8 of those together comprise a quarter. And I want you to note here that the poet is complaining about famine, at a time when wheat costs 4 shillings or more for a bushel. And that is the price in normal times of what you'd have had for a quarter. So wheat's about 8 times more than the usual prices. And there's some biological knowledge here. We know from various studies of famine that when people starve, in the latter stages of starvation, they cease to feel hunger, number one, and then they just want to sleep all the time. And you do become very pale and jaundiced as a result. And so when he says, they turned pale, who had laughed so loud, they became all docile, this strongly suggests that the poet had personal experience or first-hand knowledge of what happened to people as they starved to death. Now, the second disaster is the Black Death itself. I don't know quite why historians and always students have such an obsession with the exact timeline of the arrival of plague or exact mortality rates, because in fact it's the long-term social and economic consequences that would affect life for many millions for decades to come, much more so than the minutiae of where the plague arrived first. But nonetheless, people have worked this out. We think it probably first arrived in Britain in 1348 at Melcombe Regis near Weymouth, Dorset. And there's a little plaque somewhere there by the water that says, you know, here the Black Death entered England. What a tourist board will do for attention these days. In Wales, it's been suggested that plague probably arrives in 1349 in Gwent, that's to say in the extreme southeast from England. By May or June, it was in the Welsh borders in Worcestershire, and by mid-March, pretty much all of the Midlands and borders are affected. By June to July 1349, the plague arrives in Denbighshire, North Wales, with a secondary outbreak in August. In Ireland, plague again arrived by ship, 1348, when it reaches Dublin, quite possibly by water from the port of Bristol. That would be the most likely shipping route. And in Scotland, plague arrives in late 1348 or early 1349. And the Scots, some Scots had speculated that the plague might not get that far. Now, this timeline here, which suggests something approaching a year for the timeline of plague advance from the south coast of England through the far reaches of Scotland, might sound slow to you, but in reality, that is a remarkable speed for an infection to spread across those distances in a pre-modern setting before planes, trains, or automobiles. And this is one of a number of measures that historians have used to calculate the speed of travel from place to place. We know that we have the plague in city A at a certain date, and we have plague somewhere else just a week later. You can imagine that there must have been significant interchange of people between those two places within that narrow time frame. Plague mortality is somewhere between 33 and 50%. Historians in the 1930s, 40s were saying 50% or more. And then there were a wave of revisionists in the 60s and 70s said, oh, that must be over the top. It couldn't have been more than 1 in 3 people dying of plague. And actually, as studies have advanced, particularly in the last 20 years, they've worked out that those early historians were right. Probably 33% is a bare minimum mortality rate. At least half is more realistic. For example, in England, 45% of parish priests died. That's one measure we have, because every village by this period will have a parish church to which the villagers could walk. Every parish church has a parish priest, and if that person dies, a record has to be kept by the officiating bishop of his appointed replacement. Now, there's some question here of upland versus lowland mortality. Scotland, with much upland area, may have seen a lower mortality rate, perhaps only 1 in 3. But Wales is a tricky one to assess because lowland Wales is adjoining lowland England in many places and has a very similar society after English colonization, whereas upland Wales is radically different. William Rees and Philip Ziegler both suggest relative high mortality for Wales, but they disagree over the question of upland mortality. As I said, evidence of Scotland suggests perhaps lighter upland mortality because the kind of cattle herding upland economy means people tend to be separated from each other quite often. And you see a lot of individual farmsteads, whereas in England and areas of English colonization, you tend to see what we call nucleated villages, which is where all of the villagers live in little houses next to each other and then walk off into the fields in the morning to go farm the hinterland of the village. In Ireland, lowland areas are worst affected, and there's perhaps 33% mortality or more. What's really important to take away about Ireland is that the English colony there, the English settlers, they tend to live in nucleated settlements in relatively densely populated lowland areas, certainly much more populated than upland native areas. And so the English colonial population sees much higher mortality, it is thought, than the native Gaelic population. And in fact, this contributes strongly to a Gaelic resurgence after 1350. That's to say, by the time the plague settled down a couple of years later, suddenly we see a big push by the native Irish to reclaim territory. I've put up at the top of this slide plus 1361 to 62 because the period between 1348 to 49 and 61 to 62 is one of recurrent outbreaks of plague, sort of pockmarking the landscape of the British Isles, followed in 1361 to 2 by a second major outbreak, sometimes called the Children's Plague, because it seemed to have such a strong and disproportionate effect on the youth population. And in that outbreak, perhaps 5 to 10% of survivors of the first outbreak and their subsequent children died. So I'll give you some good quotes here. This is from Ziegler. He says, the nature of the manorial system in Wales, that is to say, the system that was imposed by English colonization, the nature of the manorial system in Wales ensured that it would bear the imprint of the plague in a way much more clear-cut and decisive than its English counterpart. In Wales, the Black Death accomplished in a year or two a revolution which in England was worked out over the whole of the 14th century. So what he's talking about here is the way in which those parts of Wales which are heavily colonized by the English are the same parts of Wales which by 1348-49 have the most nucleated villages and the most unfree bondsmen, these being the descendants of people who are coerced into coming there in early stages of English colonization. Now, because of the kind of shallow roots and minority position of unfreedom in Wales, it means that after the Black Death, peasants in Wales really quickly rise up to demand that unfree status there effectively be abolished, or they just flee from one part of Wales to another where they can get land by free tenure. That happens really quickly in Wales, within a year or two. In England, where unfree status had been in the year 1200, say, the status of as much as 80% of the lowland population, there is a major effort on the part of landlords to resist the abolition of unfreedom, to resist social change, and indeed it takes the whole of the 14th century, culminating in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, to achieve the same social change there. I throw you here a contemporary quote known in a couple of Scottish sources, where the Scots at an early stage referred to the plague as the foul death of the English. Of course, in 1348-49, this is within living memory of the last of the Scottish Wars of Independence, in which the Scots ultimately proved the victors. Unfortunately, for anyone who might have uttered this remark, they would find that within a few months the plague would reach Scotland as well. Immediate effects. Again, Bridbury writes this famous article on the Black Death in past and present. You'll find it in a reading list online, or if you just Google Bridbury Black Death, you'll find it straight away. Again, it's in the journal Past and Present. And he says that effectively we had overpopulation in England in particular, that the number of people in England circa 1300 was really more than the landscape could reasonably support. There was high unemployment, and so ultimately the plague is more purgative than toxic insofar as it removes excess population. It means that for those left behind, they can enjoy a better standard of living, more food per head, etc. Another immediate effect I've already mentioned is the abandonment of land held by bond tenure. If peasants can't get their landlord to give them a new grant of their own land by free tenure, they'll simply run away to the land of some other landlord who's desperate to get his own fields cultivated and seek to enter into property there by leasehold or freehold tenure. Wages spike. If you're either a harvest worker or even a craftsman, perhaps especially skilled craftsman, you suddenly find that with half of workers dead, your skills are in high demand, your labor is in high demand, and so you can demand a much higher wage. Grain prices fall, although the fall in grain prices augmented by the decreasing amount of land which the reduced population farms. From the 1370s especially, we see a long-term decrease in grain prices. In the immediate wake of plague, grain had actually increased slightly in value because it was hard to get the laborers out there to get it off the fields and so forth. But by the 1370s into 1380s, grain prices fall relative to their highs of the mid-14th century, whilst wages remain better than they had been. So you've got more money coming in and you spend less on food. The government has a knee-jerk reaction. It passes a so-called Ordinance of Labourers in 1349, demanding that workers ought not charge more for their labor than they had charged before the plague, and threatening imprisonment if they did so, fine or imprisonment. This becomes formalized as statute law with the so-called Statute of Labourers of 1350 to 51. Does it work? Well, there are some sporadic attempts to enforce it, but the reality is because you have such a widespread social movement of laborers recognizing the value of their labor and demanding higher wages, that it's effectively unenforceable. Now, I thought we'd take just a little closer look here at some aspects of the Statute of Labourers. As I mentioned, wages are pinned back to pre-plague levels, but it introduces some other concepts which would stay in English society and law for centuries. Number one here, compulsory service. Because landlords are so desperate to get their lands farmed, they look to the government to ensure with the Statute of Labourers that they can press into service anyone who doesn't have a job. So if the lord of the manor comes down to the village and says, I need you to work, you're not allowed to say no. He might have to pay you, but you're not allowed to say no. And this, very importantly, it also applies to women. And so, in a way, this is thought to, by historian Judith Bennett, for example, who has also published in the journal Past and Present on this topic, compulsory service. So there's Judith Bennett in the journal Past and Present. Again, you can Google that, find that easily. She has written on compulsory service and said it disproportionately affected women because whilst men already had other things they were busy doing, ploughing fields of their own and so forth, women could be pressed into service where they previously hadn't been. There's also a prohibition on giving money to beggars. Begging is to be licensed going forward. The idea is that we could tolerate beggary before when we had more workers than we knew what to do with, but at a time of labor shortage, being a beggar is unacceptable. You have to go take work as is available unless you're licensed. And so there's an attempt for the first time to differentiate, as indeed all Western governments do now, between so-called sturdy and unsturdy beggars. So a sturdy beggar would be somebody who's physically able to work but chooses not to, whereas an unsturdy beggar is envisaged as somebody who genuinely can't work because of a disability. As I mentioned in the previous slide, all of this is relatively ineffective. At least the attempts to pin wages back and press people into service as compulsory workers, that's relatively ineffective. These bits at the bottom here about the prohibition on beggars, probably ineffective at the time, but over time that becomes more important. It becomes enshrined, as we know, in English law for centuries to follow. So-called sumptuary laws are introduced, frustrated by the high wages that peasants are now earning, or even that skilled craftsmen demanding more for their wages are now earning. Laws are put in place by a nobility that feel threatened by the fact that they can no longer look down the street and necessarily differentiate based on clothing the poor peasant from the minor aristocrat. Instead, what they see is some rich merchants and even some rich peasants or peasant farmers, in fact, being able to buy high-end clothing and sort of confusing the social order as they see it. So sumptuary laws limiting what you can wear first issued in 1336 under Edward III. Now that's before the plague, I want to point out. But they're more or less ignored until after the plague, when they're brought back in 1363. And from that point, they begin to be regularly reissued in various forms. It's interesting that something that's notional back in 1336, by 1363, is a real important living issue in the minds of some. Again, enforceable, probably not. You're concerned that a merchant wearing really rich clothes might be confused with a minor noble. How do you ferret out if that person should be wearing those clothes? We'd have to walk up to them and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, are you a merchant pretending to be a noble?" At which point, if you are a noble, you'll be so offended you might well find some way to get revenge on the poor official who asked in the first place. And I give you here a place to go and look at the full text of the sumptuary laws online. Here's one part of it here. This is about the apparel of ploughmen. Just to give you a flavor, the carters, ploughmen, drivers of the plough, ox herds, cow herds, threshers of corn, and all manner of people that have not 4 shillings of goods, nor of chattels, shall not take nor wear no manner of cloth, but blanket and russet wool of 12 pence, and shall wear the girdles of linen according to their estate. So a blanket doesn't refer to an item you lay on your bed for warmth in the Middle Ages. It refers to a type of fabric which is really basic. Russet is a kind of reddish brown. It's the cheapest kind of dyed cloth there was. And the word girdle in a medieval context means a belt. So you're not allowed to wear a fancy leather belt, but rather just one made of plain linen. This just gives you a flavor. When these were reissued in 1363 after the Black Death, they're seeing a lot of poor people who suddenly have better income and cheaper food prices splash out on clothes. But the reality is, again, probably pretty unenforceable. They do, on the other hand, stimulate a way of thinking. And it's perhaps not surprising that 3 years later, in 1366, we see the sort of renewed importance of sumptuary legislation reflected in legislation that doesn't just differentiate people by social class, but also differentiates them on an ethnic basis. So this is part of the so-called Statutes of Kilkenny, issued Kilkenny in Ireland, regulating the dress of the English there. And keep in mind that after 1348-49, slowly we're seeing the native Irish roll back English colonial areas. We're seeing the English society there, the colonial society, under direct threat. And of course, people out at the fringes the sort of poor farmers caught in the middle. A great many of them are effectively adopting Irish culture, dress, even language, and the authorities in Kilkenny and other parts of Ireland are panicking. But what you see here is an attempt to regulate, again, very similar to the sumptuary laws. Quote, that every Englishman use the English custom, fashion, mode of riding, and apparel according to his estate, and that no Englishman who has the value of 100 shillings of lands or tenements or rent by the year shall ride otherwise than on a saddle in the English fashion. Again, Irish persons tended to ride bareback. Partially that's a cultural tradition, but partially it's a reflection of the relatively poor Irish populace.